The storm tore across the plains with a fury Sarah had only imagined before, conjured by fireside tales spun by her mother's voice. Thunder rolled like a war drum, its echoes swallowed by the roar of wind. Wagons creaked and groaned under the onslaught, their rattling shells straining against the tempest. The downpour crashed against wood and canvas, 1,000 icy needles stabbing through the fabric of the night. Sarah clung to the rough wooden edge of the wagon, her knuckles white, fingers slick with rain. Her breath hitched, and her chest tightened with each gust of wind that screamed past her ears. Panic twisted her stomach, a wild, clawing sensation that nearly overtook her. She pressed herself deeper into the corner of the wagon, away from the flapping canvas and the wild, hungry night. Sarah. Her mother's voice. Strain cracking. A hand had grasped her shoulder moments before, squeezing tight enough to leave bruises. But Sarah had shrugged it away in her terror. The horses had reared, their screams almost human, before the wagon jolted violently. She'd fallen, rolling across the splintered floor until her back slammed against the wheel well. Now, the silence was the most unsettling part. No voices. No footfalls. Just the storm's guttural rumble. Sarah stretched her arms out, her hands meeting nothing but wet air and cold wood. Her mother's voice was gone, swallowed by distance and storm. She couldn't see the others, couldn't hear their shouts. The world had narrowed to the storm and the dark and the pounding of her own heart. It was the first time she'd been truly alone. Her fingers trembled as she crawled forward, finding the wagon's edge with a sharp splinter of pain. She winced but welcomed the sting. It was real, tangible. She eased herself over the side, the mud sucking at her boots as she landed hard on the soaked ground. "Ma." Her voice was a thread, weak and shaking. "Pa." The rain pummeled her, ran down her face, soaked her dress until it clung to her skin like a shroud. "Anybody?" No answer came. She strained her ears, every hair on her neck prickling, as she tried to parse sound from noise. Her senses stretched, compensating for the dark that had always been her world. The storm masked everything, hiding danger and safety alike. She took a step forward and nearly toppled, her foot slipping on the slick ground. Another step, firmer this time, but the mud clung stubbornly to her shoes, anchoring her in place. Sarah's chest heaved. They wouldn't leave her. They couldn't. Her mother's fingers clawing at her arm in the dark. That had been real. But the thought of Caravan moving on without her, the wagons lumbering forward through the rain and mud, shook her more deeply than the storm ever could. "Ma," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Pa." Her throat burned, raw from the effort. She kept calling, the names breaking down into sobs until she crumpled into the mud. The storm kept raging, indifferent to her despair. She didn't know how long she lay there, her fingers sinking into the earth as if to find something solid, something that couldn't be taken from her. The wetness seeping into her skin was more than rain. It was the chill of the night, the cold of abandonment. Eventually, the world grew quieter. The storm ebbed, leaving only the occasional mutter of thunder and the pattering of drizzle. Sarah's shivers grew violent, her teeth chattering. She forced herself to her feet, her legs like lead. The air tasted different now, fresher. The scent of pine filtered through the remnants of the storm. Her other senses reached out, questing through the darkness. A rustle, almost imperceptible, caught her attention. She held her breath. Was it them? Her family? Come back to find her? But the sound was softer, stealthier. Something moving with deliberate caution. Her pulse quickened, fear buzzing beneath her skin like a hive of angry bees. She stumbled backward, her boot catching on a stone. Her arms flailed before she caught herself. It was then she heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the heavy, uneven steps of her parents, but something lighter, almost feline in its grace. She twisted, her ears tilting toward the sound. It grew nearer, the rhythm steady and sure. "Who's there?" she cried, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm lost." For a moment, there was nothing but the breeze stirring the wet grass. Then a voice, deep, measured, each word carefully enunciated. "You are not alone." She spun toward the sound, her body taut with terror and something else. Hope, perhaps. The voice was unfamiliar, rich, with an accent she couldn't place. But it was human, and that was enough. "Please," she whispered. "Can you help me?" Silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then the voice spoke again, closer this time. "You are far from your people." She nodded, her hands curling into fists. "Yes. I got lost. The storm, they're gone. I can't find them." A pause. She imagined eyes studying her, assessing. "They left you?" "No." Her voice rose, defensive, but the truth hollowed her chest. They must be looking for me. They have to be." The stranger did not answer. His presence was a weight in the darkness, solid and unsettling. When he spoke again, his words were like stones, heavy and deliberate. "The land is harsh. Alone, you will not survive." The statement landed like a blow. She fought against it, her fists clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. "I'll find them. Or they'll find me. They have to." A faint rustle of movement. Then she felt it, a hand on her arm, firm but not unkind. She gasped, her head jerking toward the touch. His skin was rough, his fingers calloused from work she could only guess at. "You are blind," he said, the words more observation than question. She swallowed hard. "Yes." Another silence. She braced herself for pity or dismissal. Instead, the stranger's voice carried a different weight. "Blindness is not weakness, but alone it is danger." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She couldn't argue. Her own body betrayed her, trembling, shivering, weak. The mud sucked at her feet, and her arms ached from holding herself upright. What are you going to do?" she asked, the question tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. The man's hand left her arm. For a moment, she feared he would leave her there, just as the others had. But then his voice reached her, quiet but certain. "I will guide you." The relief was so overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled. She nodded, her voice a broken thread. "Thank you. Please. I don't even know your name." "Hawk," he replied, his voice like the low rumble of distant thunder. "Come. The night is long, and the land is unforgiving." He took her hand, and this time she did not pull away. Sarah stumbled after Hawk, his grip steady on her arm as he guided her over the rough, uneven ground. The cold had seeped into her bones, leaving her sluggish and unsteady. His fingers were calloused but sure, their warmth radiating through the chill. It was strange to trust a stranger so readily, but the alternative was death. She clung to him like a lifeline. They moved in silence, broken only by the crunch of their feet against wet leaves and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. Every so often, Hawk's hand would tighten, an unspoken command to stop. She strained her ears, desperate to hear whatever danger he sensed. Sometimes it was the snap of a branch beneath some creature's weight, other times the mournful cry of an owl. Her imagination twisted each sound into something sharp and deadly. He kept their pace brisk, unrelenting despite her stumbling. She knew he must be frustrated by her slowness, by the way her feet tangled in roots and her arms swung clumsily to find balance. But he said nothing, his patience a force as tangible as the ground beneath her feet. Once, her toe caught on a hidden stone, and she pitched forward with a startled yelp. His grip tightened, holding her upright before she could crash to her knees. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "The earth is treacherous here." Sarah forced herself to nod, swallowing her embarrassment. "I'm trying." His response was a soft grunt, but she detected something almost like amusement in its undertone. As their journey continued, she realized he spoke little. Commands, brief acknowledgments, words of caution. They all carried the same bluntness, the same efficiency. But it was not cruelty. Hawk simply used his words like a tool, sparingly and with purpose. They walked until Sarah's legs burned and her feet throbbed. When they finally stopped, she collapsed onto a patch of dry grass, her chest heaving. Hawk's footsteps retreated briefly before returning. He pressed something into her hands, its rough texture familiar. Bread. Stale but welcome. She tore into it greedily. The silence stretched, only broken by the sound of her chewing. Eventually, Sarah found her voice. "Thank you," she said, her words muffled by the bread. "For helping me." Hawk's answer came after a pause. "I help because I must. The wild takes without mercy." Sarah swallowed hard. "And you? Do you live out here alone?" "For now." "Why?" Another pause, thicker this time. She sensed him weighing the worth of words. "My people are far. I walk where I choose." There was something in his tone she couldn't quite place. Sadness, perhaps. Or defiance. Sarah wanted to ask more, to pick apart his silences and find the truth beneath. But she didn't press. She was grateful for his guidance, and that was enough. For now. They resumed their march the next morning, her muscles aching from the relentless pace. Hawk continued to lead her with the same quiet efficiency, his grip strong and unwavering. She tried to pay attention to the land beneath her feet, to the way the ground shifted from grass to soil to rock. He pointed out plants by touch, describing their scents, their uses. Some were for healing, others for food. He spoke as if this knowledge were sacred, something passed from elder to child in voices like his, rich and steady, bearing the weight of generations. As the days dragged on, Sarah found herself growing accustomed to his presence. The silence between them felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge. He taught her how to recognize the direction of the wind by how it struck her cheeks, how to find water by the scent of moss and the coolness of air. Her senses grew sharper, her movements less clumsy. The wilderness, once an endless expanse of terror, became something almost familiar. They rested by a stream one evening, its babble constant and soothing. Hawk's voice broke the quiet. "Why were you left behind?" Sarah flinched. The question had coiled around her chest since the night of the storm, tightening until breathing itself felt like a struggle. "I wasn't left behind. Not on purpose. The storm, it was so loud. I got separated." The words tumbled out, raw and splintered. "They wouldn't leave me. They can't have." Hawk's silence was not reassuring. It was heavy, its weight pressing against her ribs. "You do not believe they are looking for you?" he asked finally. "I don't know." The admission stung, bitter as bile. Maybe they tried. Maybe they couldn't find me. Or maybe it was just easier to keep moving. Her voice cracked. "I don't know." Hawk's footsteps approached. He lowered himself beside her, the air around him warmer, somehow. "To be lost is to be forgotten," he said, the words carrying a sharp edge. "But you are not forgotten. You are here. You endure." Sarah frowned. "Enduring isn't the same as being found." "No," he admitted. "But it is the beginning." His words left her unsettled. Yet they also carried a truth she couldn't ignore. As long as she kept moving, kept breathing, she was not truly lost. Not completely. They resumed their journey the next morning. Hawk's lessons grew more detailed, more insistent. He drilled her on how to listen for water, how to differentiate animal calls from the rustle of leaves. His patience was unyielding, his expectations high, and slowly she rose to meet them. They encountered a wild boar one afternoon. Sarah felt it before she heard it, the air suddenly sharp with a musk she couldn't identify. Hawk's hand clamped over her wrist, holding her still. "Do not move," he whispered. "Listen." The beast snorts and huffs rumbled through the underbrush. Its hooves pounded against the earth, the sound of power and hunger. Hawk's fingers remained locked around her wrist until the animal's noises faded into the distance. Only then did he release her. "You heard it before I did," he said, his tone almost approving. "I smelled it," Sarah replied. "Something sour. Like old meat." "Yes. You are learning." The praise was rare, but it filled her with warmth nonetheless. The next morning, Hawk allowed her to take the lead. His presence remained just behind her, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but far enough to force her to rely on her own senses. The exercise left her drenched in sweat and nerves, but with each step, her confidence grew. They settled for the night under the canopy of a twisted oak, its branches creaking softly in the breeze. Hawk built a small fire, its glow flickering against Sarah's closed eyes. The air held a chill, but the fire's warmth soothed her aching limbs. Hawk, she asked softly. Yes. Why are you helping me? The question had been brewing for days, festering beneath her skin like a thorn. You could have left me. Why didn't you? Hawk's silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, threaded with something she hadn't heard before. Regret, perhaps. Or sorrow. Once I left someone behind. Someone I should have protected. I cannot change what was done, but I can keep you from sharing their fate. The fire crackled, its heat suddenly insufficient against the chill that crept through her. The pain in his words was a wound laid bare, something raw and unhealed. Sarah reached out, her fingers finding his arm. Thank you, she whispered. He said nothing, but his hand covered hers, strong and steady. The sun had begun to burn hotter as their journey pressed forward, the air thick with the scent of parched earth and pine. Sarah's steps had grown more sure, her feet learning to navigate the treacherous terrain with a precision she once thought impossible. Hawk had eased his guidance, allowing her to find her own way even as he shadowed her every step. She felt him as a constant presence, watchful, unyielding. They walked in silence, a language they had come to share. It was not comfort, but something akin to it. Trust forged through necessity and tempered by hardship. The world remained dark to her, but the land spoke in other ways. She had learned to read the brush of wind against her skin, the shifting rhythms of insects and birds. And most of all, she had learned to read him. Hawk's breathing grew tense, his footfalls shifting from smooth to cautious. It was a warning, subtle but unmistakable. Sarah slowed, her senses questing outward. The air felt different, heavier. Sounds reached her ears, faint but distinct. Voices, human voices, distant but drawing closer. She felt Hawk's hand on her shoulder, fingers curling in a grip neither gentle nor harsh. It spoke of urgency. Others come, he said, his voice low and sharp. They hunt. Who? She asked, her throat tightening with a fear she couldn't name. Men from your world. They search the land like wolves, hunting, not seeking. His voice grew bitter. They are not your kin. Sarah's pulse quickened. But why? Because I walk this land, Hawk replied. Because they are greedy and afraid. And because blood has been spilled where none should have been. What happened? She pressed, her voice tight. Hawk's silence was the kind she had come to understand. Guarded, deliberate. He never spoke of his past, his words always rooted in the immediate present. But there was something different now, a tension woven through his voice. Long ago, he said finally, I protected what was mine. But the settlers came, pushing us further into the wilds. They broke the earth, cut down the trees. And when my people defended what was ours, blood was spilled. Your family? She asked, her voice small. Yes. The word was a blade, clean and cold. They hunt me because I will not bend to them. They call me outlaw, savage. It matters not. They kill what they cannot control. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Hawk's kindness had not been an act of charity. It had been defiance. A refusal to let the world dictate who he could save and who he must let perish. His own grief was tangled with hers, their losses knotted by the same threads of cruelty and survival. Will they kill you? She asked, the words trembling between them. If they find us. His tone was matter-of-fact, resigned but not defeated. And they will not ask questions before drawing blood. A chill crept through Sarah's veins. She had feared the wilderness, the blind expanse of darkness that stretched out beyond her reach. But it was the men who hunted them, now, that truly terrified her. What can we do? She asked. We move faster. We leave no trail. And when the time comes, his voice hardened. We fight. The simplicity of his words struck her. Fight. It seemed such an impossible thing. She had always been the one who needed protection, who depended on others to shield her from the cruelties of the world. But Hawk's resolve was unyielding, and she drew strength from it. They quickened their pace, Hawk's urgency transforming into swiftness. His commands grew sharper, more frequent. He guided her over streams, through dense thickets, always careful to erase their tracks. She could hear the tension in his breathing, the way his voice tightened when he gave directions. It was fear, she realized. Not for himself, but for her. The pursuer's presence became more tangible with each passing day. Their voices carried on the wind, curses and threats mingling with the rustling leaves. Sometimes Sarah could even hear the distant clop of hooves, the metallic clinking of bridles. The men were relentless, their hunger for blood as relentless as the sun above. On the fourth night of their flight, Hawk led her into a cave hidden by overgrown foliage. The air inside was cool, the darkness absolute. For Sarah, it was a strange comfort to be surrounded by blackness that matched her own. Hawk built a fire, its heat modest but welcome. She could feel him sitting beside her, his presence a solid wall against the fear creeping up her spine. "Will they find us?" she asked, her voice a thread stretched thin. "If we are careless." Hawk's tone was clipped, but there was something beneath it. Fatigue, perhaps, or doubt. "We can't keep running forever," she said, the words slipping free before she could stop them. "No," he admitted, "but we can make them think we have gone another way. Confuse them. Delay them." She sensed the strain in his voice, the weariness he tried so hard to hide. "You're tired." "Everyone grows tired." His voice was rough, laced with frustration. "But it does not matter. We will survive." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not a child," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You don't have to protect me from the truth." There was a pause. When Hawk spoke, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "You are stronger than you know, but strength does not make us invincible." She nodded, swallowing the knot of fear lodged in her throat. "Teach me." Hawk's silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he had heard her. Then, slowly, his hand took hers and placed something cool and heavy in her palm. A knife. Its blade was smooth, the edge sharp against her fingers. "If the time comes," he said, his voice like iron, "you must be willing to do what is necessary." Sarah's hands trembled as she tightened her grip around the knife. The thought of using it was sickening, but the alternative was worse. "I'll do it." "Good," Hawk replied, a grim approval coloring his words. "Tomorrow we will make them believe we have gone west. They will follow our trail. And when they do, we will strike from the shadows." Sarah's throat tightened. She had never wielded a weapon before, had never considered herself capable of violence. But the world she had known was gone, torn away by the cruelty of others. And if she was to survive, she would have to become something new, something fierce. The fire crackled softly, the heat licking at her skin. She listened to Hawk's breathing, steady and measured. Her own heart raced, the rhythm chaotic and wild. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Determination, resolve. "Will you leave me?" she asked suddenly, the question sharp and desperate. "No," Hawk said, his voice steady. "We are bound now, by blood and by loss. I will not leave you." His words settled deep within her, a foundation upon which she could build her courage. Whatever the future held, she would face it. Not alone, not helpless. The night pressed in around them, but Sarah held fast to the knife, its weight a promise. They would not run forever. The dawn crept over the horizon with a pallid, merciless glow. Sarah had learned to feel the shift in the air, the way warmth seeped into the chill of night like an enemy reclaiming lost ground. She tightened her grip around the knife Hawk had given her, its weight both reassuring and alien. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the terror of what lay ahead. They had spent the night crafting their deception, leaving false trails and broken branches meant to lure their pursuers away. Hawk had spoken with a meticulous calm, describing the steps they would take, the angles of misdirection. His voice had been steady, but Sarah heard the strain beneath it. The fatigue was sharpening his words, carving away all softness. Hawk moved like a shadow, his presence precise and measured. He had taught her how to listen, how to parse the noises of the forest, until they became a language of their own. Now every twig snap and brush of leaf felt significant. Her world had expanded beyond darkness, her senses stretching to fill the void her eyes could not. "They will come from the west," Hawk said, his voice low and urgent. Their numbers grow. They are like locusts, swarming without purpose but to devour. Sarah clenched her jaw, her heart a pounding drumbeat in her chest. What do we do? We wait, he replied. Strike when their guard is down. Their arrogance is their weakness. And if they find us first, then we do not allow them the satisfaction of an easy victory. His words were stone, unyielding and final. They crouched beneath the tangled roots of a fallen tree, their bodies pressed close to the earth. Hawk's breath was shallow, his injuries from previous nights worsening. Sarah had noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way he clutched his side when he thought she wasn't paying attention. But he had refused her offers to stop, to rest. They both knew what failure would cost them. The sounds of pursuit grew louder as the hours passed. Men's voices barked orders, their accents coarse and grating. Metal clinked against metal. Horses snorted and stamped. Sarah's fingers dug into the dirt, her knuckles white around the knife's handle. She could feel Hawk's tension beside her, a coiled fury held in check only by his discipline. He placed his hand over hers, steadying the tremors that betrayed her fear. Do not think of them as men, he said. Think of them as predators. They will show no mercy. You must offer them none. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. The rawness in her throat was not from a cold, but from the sheer force of her own resolve. Hawk's words circled her mind, their truth undeniable. This was not a choice. It was survival. The men came crashing through the underbrush, their movements careless and loud. Sarah heard their laughter, the arrogance threaded through each syllable. They were not hunting for her. They were hunting for him, and they believed the task would be simple. Hawk's hand left hers, the loss of his touch as jarring as a blow. She heard the shift of his weight, the whisper of steel as he drew his weapon. His presence moved away from her, fading into the depths of the forest. For a moment, panic seized her. He was leaving her, abandoning her to the darkness. But then his voice drifted back, a ghost carried on the breeze. Do not fear the dark. It is your ally. Sarah forced herself to breathe, her lungs burning with each shallow gasp. Her senses stretched outward, grasping for any hint of Hawk's movements. But he had become part of the wilderness, indistinguishable from the trees and the wind. The first scream shattered the quiet. It was high-pitched, cut short by a brutal finality. Horses neighed in panic, their hooves tearing at the ground. The men shouted, their bravado crumbling into confusion. Another scream, closer this time. The snap of bone, the wet crunch of impact. Hawk's fury was like a storm, sudden and relentless. He struck with the precision of a hawk diving for its prey. His presence felt only when the damage was already done. Sarah crouched lower, her fingers clutching the knife so tightly it hurt. She could do nothing but listen, her own helplessness a torment she could not shake. But then the voices changed, their shouts laced with something deeper than fear. Recognition. There. The girl, she's with him, one of them bellowed. The blind witch. She felt their attention shift, their focus honing in on her like blades. Hawk's assault had been effective, but it had also drawn them straight to her. A twig snapped behind her, too close. She whirled, her knife lashing out on instinct. The blade met flesh, the impact reverberating up her arm. A scream followed, guttural and wounded. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath ragged, her pulse thrumming with wild exhilaration and terror. The man's weight collapsed beside her, his gasping sobs muffled by the ground. Blood seeped into the earth, the metallic tang sharp in her nostrils. She had hurt him, wounded him. The realization coiled within her, fierce and intoxicating. But the others were coming. Their footsteps pounded through the underbrush, their voices sharp and vengeful. Hawk's assault had thinned their numbers, but not broken their will. Sarah pressed herself against the ground, her mind racing. Hawk had taught her to listen, to read the land and its secrets. Now, she strained to do the same with her pursuers. Their anger made them careless. They shouted orders, their words slurred by panic. She shifted, her movements silent. Her fingers found a rock, smooth and solid. She hurled it into the undergrowth, the sound loud and abrupt. The men swiveled, their weapons drawn, their focus torn between imagined threats and real ones. Hawk emerged from the shadows like a creature born of darkness. He moved with lethal grace, his strikes precise and devastating. Another man fell, his scream ending in a sickening gurgle. Hawk's breathing was labored, his injuries slowing him, but his fury had not diminished. Sarah could feel the tide turning. The men's numbers were dwindling, their bravado collapsing under the weight of true danger. But Hawk was faltering, his steps uneven. Blood slicked his hands, his breaths shallow and strained. She stumbled toward him, her knife still clutched in her hand. "Hawk," she cried, her voice raw and desperate. He did not respond. Another man lunged from the trees, his weapon glinting in the dull light. Sarah reacted without thought. The knife slashed through the air, the force of her swing driven by pure, unfiltered terror. The man crumpled at her feet, his body twitching before falling still. The silence that followed was deafening. Hawk's hand found her shoulder, his grip weak but reassuring. "You fought," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "You taught me," she replied, her words trembling with exhaustion and relief. The last of their pursuers had fled, their courage shattered. The wilderness reclaimed its quiet, the bloodshed fading into memory. But Hawk's strength was fading, his body betraying him at last. Sarah guided him to the ground, her hands frantic as she tried to staunch the bleeding. His eyes closed, his breaths shallow but steady. "I will not leave you," she whispered, the words an oath she would keep. Hawk's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "You are stronger than you know," he said, his voice already slipping away. "You have found your way." Sarah's fingers clenched around his hand, her own strength an anchor against the grief threatening to consume her. The forest loomed around them, vast and unforgiving. But she was no longer afraid. The darkness was hers now. Agnes Porter woke to the low wail of the wind and the thud of something sharp and painful deep in her belly. The cabin creaked, would groaning under the weight of another restless night. Darkness pooled thickly around her, only pricked by the dim orange glow of embers still smoldering in the hearth. She lay there, rigid and sweating despite the chill, her hands clutching her stomach as if by holding herself together she could somehow press down the panic rising through her like floodwater. It was absurd, of course. A woman of 55, wrinkled by age and worn by years of work on this rough patch of land her late husband had called God's own proving ground. Pregnancy was something she'd left behind decades ago, a closed door that had locked itself with time. She had not lain with a man since Josiah had been buried, his name carved into a slab of rock on the hill where the grass grew tangled and wild. But the signs were unmistakable. Nausea, sharp and crippling, curling her over the edge of her cot. An unfamiliar tenderness in her breasts. And now, the subtle swell of her stomach beneath her nightdress, as if her own body had turned traitor. A betrayal wrapped in absurdity. Yet, in that quiet dark, there was no denying what she felt. When the morning light bled through the gaps in her walls, Agnes rose stiffly and washed her face in the basin by the window. Her fingers trembled as she braided her gray-streaked hair, her eyes refusing to meet her own reflection. What little food she managed to force down turned to stone in her gut, the sour taste of fear lingering. By mid-morning, she saddled her mare and rode into town, the familiar ache of exhaustion dogging her every step. Dusty Ridge was a place of suspicion and superstition, where a woman like her was meant to remain solitary and respectable. Anything else drew stares, sharp as broken glass. They watched her as she tied her horse outside the general store, watched her as she haggled over salt and flour, her voice strained and low. Their eyes scraped over her with curiosity sharpened by the weeks of her seclusion. She had kept to her land for so long, hiding from their judgment. But nothing stayed quiet for long in a place like this. "Morning, Agnes," the storekeeper greeted, his smile thin and uncertain. Mr. Wilkes, a man built like a stick of kindling, his shoulders hunched from years of counting pennies and counting sins. "Morning," Agnes replied, her words clipped and dry. Her eyes stayed on the shelves, avoiding the faces of those who loitered near the counter, their conversation dropping to a murmur when she entered. "Been a while since you came around," Wilkes continued, his gaze slipping over her with the kind of curiosity that made her skin itch. "Busy," she lied. "Harvesting late." Wilkes nodded, though his fingers twitched against the counter. Dusty Ridge was a town that fed on secrets, and hers was already bleeding out, leaving a trail for the scavengers to follow. When she left the store, the whispers followed her like a bad scent. Mrs. Calhoun, her mouth twisted into a permanent sneer, spoke loud enough for Agnes to hear. "They say she's gone mad, talking to herself out there, just like old Josiah before he fell to ruin." "She's cursed, that one," another voice chimed in. "Seen her stumbling around at night, clutching her belly like something's growing inside her." Agnes gritted her teeth, her hands clenched around the reins as she mounted her horse. She forced herself to ride slow through the center of town, her spine iron straight, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The eyes of Dusty Ridge burned into her back like coals. The preacher's voice boomed from the chapel as she passed, his words steeped in fire and brimstone. Reverend Callahan, the town's self-appointed moral judge and executioner. His sermons had grown louder of late, more fervent and wild-eyed. Agnes caught the edge of his voice as she rode by, something about the wicked being cast down from God's grace. Her stomach twisted, a sickly pulse of dread hammering against her ribs. She didn't believe in curses or punishment from above, but she knew what it meant to be cast out, to be branded as something wicked. Back at her farm, Agnes worked until her muscles burned, chopping wood and mending the fence where the storm had torn it loose. The labor kept her thoughts at bay, dulled the gnawing fear that had taken root deep within her. But as the sun began to sink below the hills, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, the pain in her belly returned, sharp and insistent. She collapsed against the rough-hewn table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was as if her body was fighting against itself, something pulling and tearing within her. Agnes gritted her teeth until she tasted blood. The days slipped by, a fever dream of work and pain and whispers carried on the wind. The town's rumors grew louder, twisted into tales of witchcraft and devilry. Children were forbidden to walk near her property, their mothers clutching their arms as they hurried past her land. She stopped going into town. The solitude became a shield, but it could not keep the sickness at bay. Her body swelled, her skin pulled tight and aching. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the wild around her cabin, the coyotes howling, the owls calling, the rustle of leaves against the brittle earth. One night, as the fire crackled low and her eyes drooped heavy with exhaustion, a knock rattled the door. Agnes sat up, her pulse thundering. No one came to her land, not at this hour. The knock came again, harder this time. She reached for the rifle propped against the wall, her fingers curling around the cold metal. But when she spoke, her voice was nothing but a rasp. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a voice, low and rough-edged like gravel. "Agnes Porter. I reckon you remember me." She hesitated, the familiarity of that voice sinking into her bones like poison. But it couldn't be him. That man was gone, dead or run off years ago, leaving only the scars of his betrayal behind. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning under the weight of time. And there he stood, shadowed by the moonlight, his eyes steady and calm. "Samuel Cutter," she whispered, the name tearing itself from her throat like a curse. He tipped his hat, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble, Agnes. And I reckon I'm the only one who can help you." Her grip tightened on the rifle, her heart a frantic drumbeat. But there was something in his gaze, something that made her chest hitch and her knees quiver. Desperation tangled with suspicion, and for the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope. Or perhaps just another kind of madness. Agnes held the rifle steady, her hands trembling only from the effort of keeping herself upright. Samuel Cutter lingered in her doorway, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she recognized him well enough. A drifter, a hunter, A man who once dealt in lies and ledgers when Dusty Ridge was still carving itself from the earth's hide. It had been years since she'd last seen him, when Josiah was alive and the world had made sense. And yet here he was, standing on her porch like the devil himself had sent him to taunt her. "I don't need your help," Agnes said, her voice sharp and jagged, like splintered glass. "Whatever you've come here for, you can turn right back around and leave." Samuel didn't flinch. His eyes were the same color as iron, hard and unforgiving. He stepped forward, his boots grinding against the floorboards. "You're wrong about that, Agnes. You need help more than you know." "What do you want?" she snapped, though her fingers loosened on the rifle. His confidence rattled her. Dusty Ridge bred cruel men and broken men, but Samuel Cutter had always been something else, a man with purpose, even if that purpose was steeped in sin. "Only to talk," he said. "If you want me gone after, I'll go. But I reckon you'll want to hear what I've got to say." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between the rifle and his eyes. Then, with a reluctant exhale, she set the gun aside. "Make it quick." He stepped inside, the cabin's warmth gathering around him like a shroud. Agnes lit a lamp and the light spilled over his face, revealing more years etched into his skin than she remembered. His hair was shot through with silver, his jaw still sharp but lined with something that looked like remorse. "People in town are talking about you," Samuel began, settling into a chair as if the place was his own. "And from what I saw on my way in, they're more than just talking. They're watching." Agnes clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Let them watch. I've got nothing to hide." He lifted an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Don't you?" She glared at him, but the fight was leaving her, sucked away by exhaustion and the dull, persistent pain in her belly. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her shoulders hunched. "You said you had something to tell me. Spit it out." Samuel leaned forward, his elbows braced on his knees. "You've been feeling unwell, haven't you? Sick, sore, like something's eating you up from the inside." She stiffened, suspicion creeping through her veins like poison. "How would you know that?" "Because I've been looking into some things," he replied. "People who don't have any business sticking their noses into the lives of folks like you. Powerful people, wealthy people, and I'm afraid you've caught their eye." "Why?" Agnes asked, though the words sounded frail, thin as thread. He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and creased from travel. When he laid it on the table, she saw it was a letter, written in a hand too fine and precise to belong to any man she'd ever known. "Harold Beckett," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "Rich man, lives up north in an estate the size of Dusty Ridge itself. Word is, he's been conducting experiments, twisting the natural order of things, trying to force life where it has no place growing." Agnes stared at him, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Experiments? What kind of madness are you talking about?" "The kind that leaves women like you pregnant when they've no right to be," Samuel replied. His gaze was cold and steady. "Beckett's been buying men. Doctors, scientists, men of learning who've turned their backs on God's work for greed and vanity. He's been sending them out here, testing their poisons and potions on whoever's too poor or desperate to refuse." The words clung to her like the scent of rot. You're saying I was poisoned?" "Not poisoned. Altered." His jaw tightened. "I can't tell you how, but I've seen the aftermath of his work, and it never ends well." Agnes's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table. "Why me? I've never even heard of this Beckett." "He heard of you," Samuel said, "and of Josiah. Something about your land, the way you lived, isolated, away from prying eyes. An easy target, or so they thought." The mention of Josiah's name hit her like a fist. The man she'd loved, whose memory she'd clung to even as her own body turned traitor. She narrowed her eyes. "And how do you know all this, Samuel? How do I know you're not just feeding me more lies?" "Because I was hired to find you," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "Beckett put a bounty on you. Said he needed his subject recovered before things got out of hand. But I looked into it. I saw what he did to others. Couldn't bring myself to sell you out, Agnes." even if it meant walking away from the only money I was likely to see this side of a coffin. So you just decided to help me out of the kindness of your heart, she scoffed, bitterness curdling her words. Kindness. He laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. No, I've got my own ghosts, Agnes. Reckoning to make, debts to settle. But when I learned what they'd done to you, well, I figured I might as well put a bullet in my own head if I didn't try to make things right. She wanted to hate him, to drive him from her home with curses and fire. But something in his eyes, wounded, desperate, yet unwavering, kept her rooted in place. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice brittle. I'm suggesting you let me help you, Samuel said. Beckett won't stop hunting you. Not until he's sure his little experiments played out. But if we go to him, make him answer for what he's done, maybe you'll get the peace you deserve. Agnes looked away, her gaze drifting toward the cracked window where the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. And if I refuse, then you'll keep wasting away out here until there's nothing left of you but bones and bad memories. He didn't soften his words, didn't try to coax or comfort, just stated the truth as plainly as if he were reciting scripture. She closed her eyes, her breath shuddering from her lungs. For so long, she had clung to her grief, worn it like armor. But now that armor was rusting, falling apart beneath the weight of this new, unspeakable horror. All right, she whispered. I'll go with you. But if you're lying to me, Samuel Cutter, I'll see you dead before the sun rises again. His smile was grim but genuine. Fair enough. They prepared through the night, her belongings gathered with trembling hands. As dawn crept over the horizon, Agnes stood in the doorway, her cabin a ruin of shadows behind her. Samuel waited by his horse, his expression solemn. Together, they rode away from Dusty Ridge, the unknown stretching before them like a wound waiting to be healed. The journey north was a gauntlet of wind and dust, the air brittle with cold that cut through their clothes and scraped against their skin. Agnes rode in silence, her shoulders stiff, her eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. Samuel kept pace beside her, his presence both a comfort and a threat. She distrusted him still, though the desperation that clung to him like a shadow made her believe he might be telling the truth. Whatever had driven him to seek her out, it had twisted his soul into something restless and raw. Their campfire burned low that night, flickering shadows dancing across Samuel's face as he sharpened his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Agnes sat opposite him, her back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. She chewed on a piece of dried meat, her appetite dulled by anxiety. How much further? She asked, her voice carrying a thread of impatience. 2 days' ride, maybe 3, Samuel replied without looking up. Beckett's estate is tucked away in the hills, where nobody thinks to look. That's how he likes it. Agnes snorted. Rich men always do, building their castles where no one can tear them down. He glanced at her, his gaze searching. You think this is just about money? About power? It's always about money and power, she snapped. I've seen men lie, cheat, and kill for less than a handful of coins. What makes this Beckett any different? Ambition, Samuel replied. He's not just another tyrant trying to carve out his own little empire. He's trying to remake the world, to twist nature to his own liking. And he doesn't care who he has to break to do it. Agnes felt a chill creep down her spine, colder than the night air. And you're sure he's the one who did this to me? His men, his work, Samuel said. But he's the head of the snake. Cut him down, and maybe this all ends. She studied him across the firelight, her eyes hard and unforgiving. And what's in it for you, Samuel? Redemption? Vengeance? He smiled, but it was a grim, humorless thing. Maybe a bit of both. Maybe just the satisfaction of knowing I did something worth a damn before I meet my maker. They lapsed into silence, the crackling fire their only conversation. Agnes stared into the flames, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had no illusions about her chances. Beckett was a man of means and cruelty. If he had truly marked her for his twisted designs, then she would find him and make him pay, or die trying. By the third day, the hills rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their slopes covered in dense pine and underbrush. The air grew colder, the sky grayer. Beckett's estate lay hidden beyond those hills, its vastness rumored to be guarded by men more loyal to coin than to conscience. They reached the edge of the property by nightfall. Agnes peered through the branches, her gaze fixed on the sprawling mansion that loomed like a fortress against the darkening sky. Lanterns burned along the walls, their light a pale imitation of day. The estate was surrounded by a high iron fence, its spikes tipped with rust and cruelty. Samuel crouched beside her, his breath misting in the chill. There'll be guards patrolling the grounds. Beckett doesn't leave anything to chance. And you have a plan, I assume? Agnes's tone was sharper than she intended, but the nerves twisting her insides made her voice brittle. We sneak in through the west entrance, Samuel said. Servants' quarters. Less security. Once we're inside, we find Beckett and make him answer for what he's done. And if we don't find him? Agnes asked, her fingers brushing the pistol she kept strapped to her hip. Then we burn the place to the ground, Samuel replied. His eyes gleamed with a feral intensity that both unnerved and inspired her. They moved under the cover of darkness, their steps cautious and soundless. Agnes's heart hammered in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of her own frailty. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the grim determination that had carried her this far. The servants' quarters were a warren of narrow hallways and low ceilings, the air thick with the smell of sweat and stale bread. Samuel led her through the maze with the certainty of a man who had spent his life navigating danger. They slipped through a kitchen where the remains of a meager supper lay scattered across a long wooden table. Voices drifted from an adjoining room. Laughter mingled with the clink of glass. Agnes felt her skin prickle with tension, but Samuel's hand on her arm kept her steady. Upstairs, the grandeur of Beckett's wealth revealed itself in polished marble floors and oil paintings framed in gold. The air was cool and perfumed, a sharp contrast to the earthy scents of the servants' domain. They crept through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Agnes's breathing grew shallow, her mind torn between terror and fury. All her pain, all her isolation, traced back to this man. A man she had never met, yet who had found a way to invade her life with cruelty and indifference. A door at the end of a hallway stood slightly ajar, and from within came the murmur of voices. Samuel nodded to her, his expression hard as stone. Agnes pressed herself against the wall, her hand tightening around the pistol's grip. They moved closer, inching toward the door until they could peer through the gap. Inside, Harold Beckett stood by a tall window, his silhouette framed by moonlight. He was a man in his 50s, his hair silvered but his posture regal. His eyes glittered with an arrogance that sent a surge of anger through Agnes's veins. Beside him stood another man, lean and sharp-featured, his expression that of a predator. They were speaking in low tones, but Agnes caught enough words to stoke her fury. The experiment was a failure, Beckett said, his voice smooth and cold. The subject will perish soon enough. Another miscalculation, but progress nonetheless. And the bounty hunter? The other man asked. Cutter? Likely dead or soon to be, Beckett replied with a dismissive wave. He was useful until he turned traitor. No matter. We'll continue the trials elsewhere. There are always more willing subjects. Agnes's blood boiled. The casual cruelty, the utter disregard for the lives he had destroyed. She nudged Samuel, her eyes blazing with resolve. Now, she whispered. They burst into the room, guns drawn. Beckett spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. The other man lunged forward, but Samuel shot him down with ruthless precision. Beckett stumbled backward, his composure cracking. What is the meaning of this? Agnes aimed her pistol squarely at his chest. You did this to me. You stole my life. Now you're going to pay for it. He sneered, though his voice trembled. You're nothing but a failed experiment, a creature destined to be discarded. Agnes's hand trembled, rage and grief warring within her. But she kept her aim steady, her resolve unshaken. You're the one who's failed, she said, her voice cold and certain. And you're not leaving this place alive. Beckett's eyes widened, his arrogance melting into terror. Samuel's voice cut through the air, harsh and final. "Do it, Agnes. End this." Agnes's finger hovered over the trigger, her pulse a thunderous beat that roared in her ears. Harold Beckett stood before her, his eyes darting between her and Samuel with the desperation of a man cornered. The arrogance had slipped from his face, leaving only a pale, quivering mask that stoked her fury like dry tinder to a flame. "End this?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "You think it's that simple, Samuel?" "It's as simple as justice," Samuel replied. His gaze locked on Beckett like a wolf eyeing prey. "He did this to you, Agnes. All the suffering, all the pain. And he'd do it again without a second thought." Beckett's mouth twisted into a sneer, his lip curling as if he couldn't help himself. "You think you're righteous, woman? Coming here with a gun and a grudge? You're nothing more than an anomaly, a failed experiment. You should thank me for what little life you have left." Her grip tightened, knuckles white against the polished wood of the pistol. "You think what you did was some kind of gift," she spat. "You tore my life apart. You left me suffering in the dark, wondering if I'd gone mad. And for what? Some twisted pursuit of power." "Power is everything," Beckett said, his voice growing steadier, more confident. "And I was close, closer than any man before me. A child born from one who could not conceive, brought forth by science where nature failed. You were a testament to my brilliance, even if you were too weak to see it through." "I am not weak," Agnes growled, the words coming from deep within her chest. "And I am not yours to control." The shot was deafening, the recoil snapping her arm backward. Beckett cried out, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh. Blood seeped between his fingers, darkening the pristine white of his shirt. He staggered backward, colliding with the edge of his desk before crumpling to the floor. "Damn you," he shrieked, his voice high and thin. "You've doomed yourself. Without me, you'll wither away, nothing but a rotting corpse waiting for the worms." Agnes stepped forward, her gaze cold and unwavering. "Better that than living as your experiment." He looked up at her, eyes gleaming with hatred. "You think killing me will end this? Others will follow in my footsteps. There's profit in it, power beyond your reckoning." "Maybe so," she said, her tone flat. "But they won't have you to guide them." She lowered the pistol, her hands shaking now that the rage had spent itself. The weight of her actions settled on her shoulders, but it was not guilt she felt. It was something closer to relief. Samuel moved to her side, his eyes never leaving Beckett. "He's not dead. Not yet. You want me to finish it." Agnes shook her head, her fingers still curled around the grip of her pistol. "No. He'll face justice the right way. I won't become what he tried to make me." "Right way?" Samuel's lips twisted in a grimace. "Men like him don't face justice. They dodge it, twist it, by it. Killing him now would be a mercy." "Maybe so," she admitted. "But if I kill him in cold blood, then I'm just another monster. I need to be better than that." A groan from Beckett drew their attention. His face had gone ashen, blood pooling beneath him. But his eyes were still sharp, calculating even in agony. "You'll regret this," he gasped, his words punctuated by shallow, wheezing breaths. "Letting me live, it'll be your undoing." "I'll take my chances," Agnes replied, her voice as hard and cold as the steel in her hand. They bound Beckett with strips torn from his own silk curtains. His feeble attempts at protest, nothing more than pitiful murmurs. Samuel's hands were steady, his movements efficient and unyielding. When they finished, Beckett lay on the floor like some wounded beast, his once gilded power stripped down to blood and bone. Agnes met Samuel's gaze, searching his eyes for doubt or resentment. Instead, she found only a weary acceptance, the kind of resignation that comes when a man has seen too much of the world's cruelty. "We need to leave," Samuel said, his voice low. "The guards will notice something's wrong soon enough." Agnes nodded, her body moving on instinct even as her mind spun with 1,000 unanswered questions. They slipped from the mansion under the cover of darkness, their steps swift and sure. Samuel's knowledge of the grounds proved true, and they were clear of the estate's perimeter before the first alarmed shout pierced the night. Their horses waited where they had left them, tethered among the trees. Agnes swung into the saddle with a grunt, the pain in her belly a dull ache that throbbed with every movement. Samuel glanced at her, concern flickering across his features. "You all right?" he asked. "I will be," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "Just need to put some distance between us and that damn place." They rode through the night, the hills swallowing them whole. Agnes let the cold air scour her lungs, each breath a battle against the pain that pulsed within her. Her thoughts drifted between the memory of Beckett's sneering face and the weight of her own choices. Mercy had never been her strong suit, but something in her had refused to grant him the clean death he likely deserved. They made camp near a shallow stream, the dawn breaking pale and gray above the treetops. Samuel built a fire, his hands working with mechanical precision. Agnes watched him, her gaze tracing the lines etched deep into his skin. "You think I made a mistake?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Samuel stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. But it was your mistake to make." She nodded, her lips twitching into a faint, weary smile. "I suppose that's true enough." For a long time, they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire their only company. Agnes felt the exhaustion seep into her bones, but beneath it lay something unfamiliar, a sense of control, of ownership over her own fate. She had confronted the man who had stolen her life, had chosen mercy when vengeance had seemed so easy. As the sun crept higher into the sky, she glanced at Samuel. "You'll leave, won't you? Go back to whatever life you were living before all this." "I'm not sure there's much of a life left to go back to," he admitted. "But I reckon I'll keep moving. Can't seem to stay in one place for long." "Then what will you do?" Agnes asked, her voice soft but firm. "Now that this is over." Samuel shrugged, his gaze never straying from the fire. "Try to make amends, I suppose. Help where I can. And if trouble follows me, well, I'll handle it." Agnes nodded, her chest tight with something that felt too much like grief. But as the fire crackled and the day grew brighter, she realized it wasn't grief at all. It was hope, fragile and unfamiliar, but alive. "You've helped me," she said. "More than you know." Samuel's smile was faint but genuine. "Maybe I was just paying a debt. Or maybe, just maybe, I was trying to do something right for once." They broke camp not long after, their paths destined to diverge. But as Agnes watched Samuel ride away, his figure shrinking against the endless horizon, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. Her body was still frail, her future uncertain. But her spirit, her will, had never been stronger.